Welcome to Blurr. Today we step into the dark and unsettling world of Ted Bundy, a name that still sends chills across generations. Behind a calm face and charming personality hid something far more disturbing. But what exactly made his story so unforgettable? Stay with us as we uncover a mystery that will keep you questioning everything. If you enjoy suspenseful real stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and press the bell icon so you never miss an update. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read them all. Chapter 1. The Boy with the Perfect Smile. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was 22 years old and unmarried. His father has never been conclusively identified. From the very first breath he drew into the world, Ted Bundy's life was wrapped in secrecy and shame. Eleanor's family, devout and conservative, feared the social consequences of an illegitimate child, so they did what many families did in that era. They lied. Ted was raised believing that his grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, were his parents, and that his biological mother was his older sister. This foundational deception, a lie about who he was and where he came from, would become a thread woven through the entire tapestry of his life. The family relocated to Tacoma, Washington, in 1950, when Ted was 4 years old. His mother eventually married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook, and Ted took his stepfather's surname. By all outward appearances, the Bundy household was stable and unremarkable. Ted was a good student. He was charming, articulate, well-liked by teachers. He had a wide, disarming smile that seemed to put everyone at ease. But beneath that surface, something was already forming. Neighbors later recalled that young Ted had a habit of surrounding himself with knives, once discovered placing them around his sleeping aunt in a way that terrified her. He himself recalled in later years a childhood fascination with detective magazines and true crime stories, particularly those featuring images of violence against women. He would browse these magazines at newsstands, absorbing their contents with an intensity that he described as deeply satisfying. His grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was known to be a violent and domineering man who abused animals and terrorized his family. Some researchers believe that Ted's early exposure to this model of masculine cruelty left a lasting imprint. Others point to his illegitimate birth and the subsequent identity deception as the root of his psychological dislocation. The truth is likely both and more besides, because Ted Bundy was not made in a single moment. He was assembled, slowly, out of secrets and silence, and something dark that grew quietly in the space between. He was bright enough to earn a scholarship to the University of Washington, where he studied psychology. He was socially capable enough to date, to charm, to hold friendships. He volunteered for a suicide prevention hotline. He worked on political campaigns. He was, in every visible way, a promising young man navigating the world with confidence and intelligence. Those who knew him uniformly described someone who seemed too good to be true. Perhaps that is because he was. Chapter 2. Stephanie and the Shattered Self. In 1967, while studying at the University of Washington, Ted Bundy met a young woman from California. For legal and personal reasons, she has been referred to in most accounts by the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks. She was everything Ted aspired to be: wealthy, sophisticated, from a prestigious family, beautiful in a way that commanded attention. She had long dark hair, parted in the middle. She wore it straight. Ted fell for her with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. He was 20 years old, insecure beneath his charm, still uncertain of his origins and his place in the world. Stephanie represented a life he wanted desperately to belong to. They dated for several years. She seemed to enjoy his company, but she ultimately broke off the relationship around 1968, telling friends that he lacked direction and ambition. She found him immature. She moved back to California. The rejection devastated him. He spiraled. He dropped out of college, drifted between jobs, and disappeared into a period of profound depression and purposelessness. Those who knew him say he was never quite the same after Stephanie. He had loved her with everything he had, and she had looked at what he offered and found it insufficient. Then something strange happened. Ted remade himself. He re-enrolled at the University of Washington, this time as a psychology major. He became politically active, working for the Washington State Republican Party. He was noted by supervisors as exceptionally capable, articulate, and impressive. He was recommended for law school. He was described, in one letter of recommendation, as one of the finest young men he had ever known. Around 1973, now attending law school at the University of Puget Sound, he re-entered Stephanie's life. He pursued her again, slowly and methodically, presenting himself as a changed man, the man of direction and ambition she had once said he lacked. She fell for it. They began dating again. She began entertaining thoughts of marriage. And then, without warning or explanation, Ted stopped calling. He stopped writing. He vanished from her life as suddenly and completely as she had once vanished from his. When she finally reached him and demanded an explanation, he told her he had no idea what she was talking about. He had no interest in her. He barely remembered who she was. Stephanie was bewildered and heartbroken. She would later realize, with a cold chill, that what she had experienced was not a relationship ending. It was a punishment being administered. Ted had come back into her life not because he loved her, but because he wanted to destroy her, as she had destroyed something in him. He had seduced her in order to discard her. He had made her fall in love with him so that he could take it away. This, many researchers believe, was the moment the mask fully solidified. The man who walked away from Stephanie was no longer confused or wounded. He had learned something about power and control. He had discovered that he could make people love him, and that love placed in the right hands was a weapon. By this time, women had already begun to disappear. Chapter 3. The killing begins. The first murders attributed to Ted Bundy are believed to have occurred in 1974, though some investigators have speculated that violence in his life began even earlier. What is documented and established beyond serious dispute is this. In the first months of 1974, young women in the Pacific Northwest began vanishing. Joni Lenz, also known by the pseudonym Sharon Clark, was not killed but was attacked in her own bed in her Seattle home on the night of January 4, 1974. She was beaten with a metal rod taken from her own bed frame and sexually assaulted. She was left for dead. She survived, but spent weeks in a coma and suffered permanent neurological damage. She was 18 years old. On February 1, 1974, Linda Ann Healy disappeared from her basement bedroom in Seattle. She was a 21-year-old University of Washington student who worked as a radio announcer for a local skiing program. Her nightgown was found hanging in her closet, blood-stained at the neck. Her sheets were similarly bloodied. She had been taken from her bed in the night. Her body would not be found for over a year. They kept disappearing. Donna Manson, 19, vanished in March 1974 while walking to a campus jazz concert at Evergreen State College. Susan Reincourt, 18, disappeared in April from Central Washington State College. Roberta Parks, 22, vanished in May from Oregon State University. Brenda Ball, 22, was last seen in June at a tavern in Berrien, Washington. Georgianne Hawkins, 18, disappeared in June from an alley behind her sorority house at the University of Washington. There was no obvious pattern at first. These were young women at different schools, in different towns, vanishing under different circumstances. But investigators began to notice something. Many of them had similar physical characteristics. They were young, attractive, with long dark hair parted in the middle. They looked, many people would later note, like Stephanie. In July 1974, the disappearances became more brazen. On the afternoon of July 14th, at Lake Sammamish State Park near Seattle, multiple witnesses reported seeing a young man with his arm. He introduced himself as Ted. He asked for help with his sailboat. He was friendly, handsome, well-spoken. Several women declined his request and later reported the encounter to police. 2 did not decline. Janice Ott, 23, and Denise Naslund, 19, disappeared from the park that afternoon. Their remains were later found on a hillside east of the park. Witness descriptions of the man named Ted were startlingly consistent. He was about 6 feet tall, athletic build, brown hair, with an open, engaging manner. He wore a cast or a sling. He drove a Volkswagen Beetle. Police had a description. They had a first name. What they did not yet have was any idea of the scale of what they were facing. Chapter 4. Colorado and the Chi Omega Massacre. In late 1974, Ted Bundy relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah, to attend the University of Utah Law School. The killings followed him, in Utah and Colorado. Throughout 1974 and 1975, more young women disappeared. Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura Ama, Deborah Kent. Each one young, each one brunette, each one taken with a terrifying efficiency that left almost no evidence. Bundy had refined his methods. He was organized, patient, and utterly without remorse. In Colorado, Karen Campbell was abducted from a ski lodge in Snowmass Village in January 1975. Her body was found weeks later on a road near the lodge. Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, Melanie Cooley, Shelley Robertson. The list continued to grow. Each name a young life ended without warning. Then, on August 16, 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer named Bob Hayward noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving without its headlights in a neighborhood near his home in Granger, Utah. He ran the plates and discovered the car belonged to Theodore Robert Bundy. When he pulled the vehicle over, Bundy was calm and cooperative. But as Hayward examined the car, he noticed something unusual. The front passenger seat had been removed. The front passenger seat had been removed. A search of the vehicle turned up a ski mask, a crowbar, handcuffs, rope, and strips of torn fabric. Bundy told the officer the items were harmless. He had found the handcuffs at a dumpster. He liked to ski. There was an explanation for everything. He was arrested, initially on suspicion of burglary, but investigators were already piecing together a larger picture. Detectives in Utah and Colorado had been sharing notes. A survivor, Carol Derringe, had escaped an attempted abduction in November 1974, when a man claiming to be a police officer had lured her into his Volkswagen, put handcuffs on her wrist, and swung a crowbar at her head. She had escaped by throwing herself from the moving vehicle. Derringe identified Ted Bundy from a lineup. He was convicted of aggravated kidnapping and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. He was extradited to Colorado to stand trial for the murder of Karen Campbell. And it was in Colorado, in 1977, that Ted Bundy did something that would define the second act of his story. He escaped. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was granted access to the Pitkin County Courthouse Law Library in Aspen to research his own case. While there, he jumped from a second-story window and fled into the mountains. He was recaptured 8 days later, thinner and suffering from the altitude, still wearing the clothes he had jumped in. 6 months later, he escaped again. On December 30, 1977, he crawled through a hole he had been slowly cutting in the ceiling of his cell and dropped into the apartment of the jailer who lived above. The jailer and his wife were out. Bundy helped himself to their food, changed his clothes, took some cash, and walked out the front door. By the time his absence was noticed the next morning, he had an 18-hour head start. He drove to Chicago, then took a bus to Ann Arbor, Michigan, then traveled south. He arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, on January 8, 1978. He rented a room near Florida State University under a false name. He was free, anonymous, and deeply dangerous. 15 days later, on the night of January 14, 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. What happened in that house in the early hours of the morning was the most savage act of his documented crimes. He attacked 4 women in their beds with a log he had taken from outside the building. Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman were killed. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were gravely injured. He left the house, attacked another woman in her apartment nearby, and disappeared into the Tallahassee night. The attack lasted less than 15 minutes. The ferocity of it shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers who responded to the scene. 3 weeks later, on February 9, 1978, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach disappeared from her middle school in Lake City, Florida. She was his last known victim. Her body was found in an abandoned pig shed in April. Chapter 5. The Capture, the Trial, and the Performance. On February 15, 1978, a Pensacola police officer named David Lee noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly through a residential neighborhood at 2 in the morning. The vehicle had stolen license plates. When Lee activated his lights, the driver attempted to run but was subdued after a struggle. The driver gave the name Kenneth Missner. A check revealed the name was false. The man in custody was Ted Bundy. He had been free for 46 days. He had used that time to kill at least 3 more people. The trial that followed became one of the most extraordinary media spectacles in American legal history. Bundy, who had briefly studied law, insisted on serving as his own co-counsel. He cross-examined witnesses. He delivered arguments to the jury. He was eloquent, self-possessed, and at times genuinely impressive as a legal tactician. He seemed to relish the attention, the cameras, the audience. The courtroom became his theater. He smiled for cameras. He received letters and marriage proposals from women who had watched him on television. He charmed journalists and legal observers who admitted, uncomfortably, that he was not what they had expected. He was too articulate, too composed, too compelling. His defense strategy was aggressive. He challenged evidence. He attacked the credibility of witnesses. He spoke about himself in the third person during legal arguments. He dressed carefully. He groomed himself meticulously. He was, to the very end, performing. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Bite mark evidence taken from the body of Lisa Levy was matched to Ted Bundy's distinctive teeth with its uneven alignment in what was at the time a landmark forensic comparison. Fibers and hair evidence connected him to multiple scenes. Carol Daronch remained a credible and unshaken witness. And there were the survivors of Chi Omega, Karen Chandler, and Kathy Kleiner, who had lived through what he had done. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours. On July 24, 1979, Ted Bundy was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the Chi Omega attacks. The judge, Edward Cowart, sentenced him to death. Judge Cowart, a measured and formal man, said something to Bundy before sentencing that has been quoted many times since. He told him that he was a bright young man, that he would have made a good lawyer, and that it was a tragedy that circumstances had brought them together in this way. He said he sincerely felt sorry for him. Then he sentenced him to die in the electric chair. Bundy was subsequently tried and convicted for the murder of Kimberly Leach. He received another death sentence. He spent a decade on death row. Chapter 6. The Psychology of a Predator. What made Ted Bundy so frightening was not merely the number of his victims, though the numbers are staggering. Investigators have attributed at least 30 homicides to him across 7 states, and Bundy himself suggested the true number was much higher. Some estimates range into the hundreds, though these figures remain disputed and unverified. What made him frightening was the gap between what he appeared to be and what he was, between the handsome, well-spoken law student who volunteered at a crisis hotline and the man who bludgeoned sleeping women in the dark. Most killers, when caught, reveal something that allows us to make sense of the distance between their public face and their private violence, a history of obvious social failure, a pattern of documented cruelty, something that, in retrospect, explains the leap. With Bundy, the gap resisted explanation. People who knew him struggled to reconcile their memories with the facts. His longtime girlfriend, a woman known publicly as Elizabeth Kendall, with whom he had a relationship spanning most of his years of killing, wrote later that she had loved him genuinely and had seen no signs of what he was. She described a man who was tender, funny, occasionally depressed, and completely ordinary in his private life. Psychologists and criminologists have offered a range of frameworks for understanding him. He has been classified as a psychopath, a narcissist, a sadist. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit used him as one of their foundational case studies in developing the concept of the organized serial killer, a classification describing offenders who plan carefully, select victims strategically, and manage evidence methodically. Dr. Al Carlisle, a psychologist who evaluated Bundy at the Utah State Prison, described him as someone who had developed an elaborate internal fantasy world from an early age, a world in which dominance and control were the organizing principles of the organizing principles. His desires, violence, Carlisle concluded, was not an aberration for Bundy. It was an expression of a deeply organized internal architecture. Bundy himself offered explanations in his final days, though they must be understood as strategic and self-serving rather than honest. He spoke of pornography as the gateway, claiming that exposure to violent and degrading material had gradually corrupted him. Many researchers dismissed this account as an attempt to shift responsibility and to provide a simple narrative for a complex reality. Bundy had spent his life performing, and his death row interviews were, in many ways, his final performance. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: Ted Bundy possessed above-average intelligence and used it deliberately. He understood social norms and deployed them as camouflage. He felt no genuine empathy for his victims, even while being capable of mimicking emotional connection convincingly. He experienced his victims not as people, but as objects, repositories of a power he needed to take for himself. And crucially, he enjoyed it. The interviews he gave in his final weeks to FBI agent William Hagmaier and to psychologist James Dobson contain moments of unmistakable relish. Beneath the careful language about pornography and society and responsibility, there is a man who is remembering things he loved. Chapter 7. The Confessions. In the weeks before his execution, Ted Bundy became a reluctant and carefully managed oracle. He had spent years on death row filing appeals, maintaining his innocence publicly, even while the evidence against him was definitive. His appeals had been exhausted. The date was set. And suddenly, Bundy began talking. He granted extended interviews to FBI agent William Hagmaier, with whom he had developed an unusual rapport over several years. He spoke to psychologist James Dobson, the founder of Focus on the Family, in a now famous interview conducted the day before his execution. He spoke to investigators from multiple states, offering information about murders that had gone unsolved for years. His stated motivation was to prevent other killings, to help law enforcement understand what he knew about other cases. Investigators who worked with him had a more cynical reading. He was, they believed, using the confessions as a bargaining chip, hoping to trade information for stays of execution and additional time. Governor Bob Martinez of Florida refused to delay the execution in exchange for information, a decision that was controversial at the time, but that most observers now consider correct. The confessions themselves were remarkable in their detail and their emotional flatness. Bundy spoke about his victims in clinical, almost architectural language. He described planning, surveillance, approach, and method with the precision of someone narrating a professional process. There was little audible grief, no expressions of genuine remorse that convinced the people in the room. He confirmed killings in Washington, Utah, Colorado, Oregon, Idaho, California, and Florida. He described victims whose cases had been open for years, providing locations of remains that investigators subsequently found. He gave families answers they had been waiting for across a decade. He also deflected. He spoke of the killer as though he were a separate entity, describing what the killer felt and why the killer acted. This grammatical distancing was noted by every investigator who sat across from him. It was, they felt, one final attempt to preserve a portion of his self-image, to keep some thin partition between the man he wanted to believe he was and the man he had actually been. Hagmaier, who spent more time with Bundy than perhaps anyone else in those final years, described him as someone who was genuinely incapable of true introspection. He could analyze his behavior as a scientist, analyze as a specimen, but he could not feel it. The remorse he expressed was intellectual, a recognition that what he had done was classified as wrong, rather than an emotional experience of the weight of those 30 or more lives ended. In the Dobson interview, broadcast widely after his execution, Bundy said that he was not the product of monster factories. He was raised in a good home by good parents. He was not a social reject. He said these things as though they were exculpatory, as though the ordinariness of his origins made the horror of his actions more explicable rather than less. Many who watched the interview were struck by the same question. If someone like Ted Bundy could exist beneath the surface of a normal life, then what did normal actually mean? It was an uncomfortable question. It remains one. Chapter 8. The Women He Left Behind. The story of Ted Bundy is often told as his story. His psychology, his charm, his crimes, his execution. But the more important story, the one that matters more, and is told less, belongs to the women he killed, and to the women who survived him. Kathy Kleiner Rubin was asleep in her room at the Chi Omega sorority house when Ted Bundy entered. She woke to agony. Her jaw was broken in multiple places. Several of her teeth were knocked out. Her roommate's bed was empty. It took years of surgeries and reconstruction to restore her face. It took much longer than that to process what had happened in those seconds while she slept. Karen Chandler, who shared Kathy's room, survived as well, with similarly grievous injuries. Carol Deranche, who threw herself from Bundy's moving Volkswagen in Utah in 1974, testified against him at trial with a composure that struck observers as extraordinary. She had been lucky, and she knew it, and the knowledge of how close she had come was something she carried for decades. These women are not footnotes. They are the people who lived the reality that Bundy spent a decade aestheticizing for television cameras and law enforcement audiences. They are the ones who understand, in a way that no profile or documentary can fully convey, what Ted Bundy actually was. Linda Ann Healy's family searched for her for over a year before her remains were found on Taylor Mountain in March 1975. Her skull was recovered. For her parents, the discovery was both an ending and a continuation. The grief did not stop when they found her. It changed shape. The families of the women he killed navigated grief under extraordinary conditions. Many of them did so without answers for years, sometimes without the return of remains. Some never received closure in any conventional sense. They buried absence. They commemorated names attached to disappearances rather than confirmed deaths. They waited, and the waiting was its own kind of violence. And then, when Bundy became famous, when the books and the documentaries and the true crime industry discovered him, they had to watch the man who had destroyed their families become a cultural figure. They had to hear women describe him as attractive, charming, magnetic. They had to watch him smile on television and receive letters from admirers. Carolyn Boone, who had known Bundy from his political work in Washington, visited him regularly in prison, testified on his behalf during his trial that she loved him, and married him in a Florida courtroom in a ceremony performed by Bundy himself, exploiting a legal provision that made a declaration of marriage before a judge legally binding. She later gave birth to his daughter, the mechanics of which remain unclear given prison regulations. She eventually left him and moved away, taking her daughter and severing all contact. The daughter grew up somewhere in America, with a different name, trying to live a life that had nothing to do with her father's. These are the lives shaped by Ted Bundy that rarely make it into the documentaries. Not the hunt, not the courtroom theater, not the confessions. The after. The long, unnarrated after. Chapter 9. The Execution. January 24th, 1989. The Florida State Prison at Stark. Outside the prison, crowds had gathered through the night. Some held candles, others held signs. A significant number had come to celebrate, drinking beer from coolers in the cold pre-dawn hours, cheering and chanting as the hour approached. It was a scene that disturbed many observers, not because it seemed inappropriate to want justice served, but because the festive energy raised questions about what was being celebrated and why. Inside the prison, Ted Bundy had spent his final night in conference with his attorney, and in private. He had eaten his last meal, steak and eggs. He had reportedly asked for an omelet, but had been told there was no cook available at that hour, a detail so mundane it seems almost impossible, next to the magnitude of the occasion. He had by this point confirmed the murders of 30 women and girls. He had provided information about remains in multiple states. He had given investigators enough detail to close cases and offer answers to families who had waited for years. And then he had run out of things to trade. At 7 in the morning, Ted Bundy was strapped into the electric chair known to prison staff as Old Sparky. He was 42 years old. He had spent the last 11 years of his life on death row. He had filed appeal after appeal, bought time through legal process, and ultimately exhausted every avenue. He was permitted to make a final statement. He spoke briefly, telling his family and friends that he loved them. He thanked his spiritual advisor, a Methodist minister named Fred Lawrence, who had become a figure of genuine comfort to him in his final days. Witnesses described Bundy as visibly frightened in his final moments, the composure he had maintained for years cracking at last, in the face of what could not be performed away. At 7:15 in the morning, the current was applied. He was pronounced dead 2 minutes later. Outside the prison, the crowd erupted. People cheered, set off fireworks, held up handmade signs. Vendors sold souvenirs. The entire scene was broadcast live on television. Newspapers ran headline after headline. The execution of Ted Bundy was treated in much of America as a kind of conclusion, an ending that answered something. But of course it answered very little. The dead remained dead. The survivors remained survivors. The families remained families. The questions about how someone like Bundy exists in the world, how he moves through it undetected, how he chooses his victims and constructs his masks, those questions did not die with him. They remained. They remained still. Ann Rule, the true crime writer who had known Bundy personally during his early years in Seattle, and who wrote the definitive account of his life called The Stranger Beside Me, watched the coverage from her home. She had known him as a kind and thoughtful colleague at the crisis hotline where they had both volunteered. She had genuinely liked him. For years after his arrest, she had struggled to reconcile her memory of him with what he was. She never entirely stopped struggling. She said later that the execution brought her no satisfaction. It brought only a final confirmation of something she had been trying to accept for 15 years, that the person she had known had never fully existed. Chapter 10. The Legacy, the Myth, and the Warning. In the decades since Ted Bundy's execution, he has become something unprecedented in American culture. He has become a myth. Books, documentaries, television series, feature films, podcast episodes, and online discussion threads number in the thousands. Netflix released a documentary series and a narrative film within months of each other in 2019. The films generated millions of views and enormous controversy, particularly regarding the casting and the framing of Bundy as a figure of dark charisma. Zac Efron, who played Bundy in the film, was considered by many an uncomfortable choice for a role that required a degree of aesthetic admiration to be built into the viewing experience. The controversy around these productions revealed something important about how we process serial killers in the cultural imagination. We tell their stories compulsively, returning to them again and again, repackaging them in new formats for new generations of consumers. We debate their intelligence, their charm, their appearance. We analyze their childhoods and theorize about their pathologies. And in doing so, we occasionally, perhaps inevitably, glamorize them. This glamorization is not harmless. The families of Bundy's victims have said so directly. The women he attacked, the ones who survived, and who have chosen to speak publicly, have said so directly. When the story of a murderer becomes a cultural product, when his name becomes a brand, the victims are reduced to supporting characters in his narrative. Their deaths become plot points. Their lives become footnotes to his biography. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which Bundy helped to create through his own case, has produced frameworks for understanding and identifying organized serial offenders that have guided investigations for decades. His case contributed to the development of criminal profiling as a discipline. The National Violent Crime Apprehension Program, which creates databases of violent crimes to assist investigators in linking cases across jurisdictions, grew in part from the lessons of how long it took law enforcement agencies to connect Bundy's crimes to a single offender. In this narrow sense, something of investigative value emerged from the catastrophe of his crimes. Better tools, better protocols, better communication between law enforcement agencies in different states. But we should be careful about leaning too hard on that framing. It risks constructing a redemptive arc where none exists. The lesson of Ted Bundy is not that evil produces useful knowledge. The lesson is simpler and harder than that. The lesson is that danger does not always look like danger. That charm is not character. That the warmth a person projects into the world can be entirely manufactured. That the most frightening predators are not the ones who look frightening. They are the ones who look exactly like someone you would trust. Ted Bundy charmed his way through the world for more than a decade because people could not believe what they were looking at. The women he approached at Lake Sammamish saw a handsome man asking for help with his boat. The students who knew him at the University of Washington saw a committed young man with a bright future. The women on death row who wrote him letters saw a wrongly accused victim of a zealous justice system. The image he projected was so persuasive that it continued to find audiences even after his guilt was beyond all question. This is perhaps his most lasting legacy and his most important warning. Not the body count, not the courtroom drama, not the escape, the mask itself. The absolute precision with which an intelligent, motivated, fundamentally hollow human being can construct a persona that passes all casual inspection. We want to believe that evil announces itself, that it has a face we can recognize, a manner that puts us on guard, a quality that separates it from the ordinary. Ted Bundy spent his entire adult life demonstrating that this is not always true, that sometimes evil has a good smile, a firm handshake, an engaging way of making you feel seen and interesting, that sometimes it helps you carry your groceries to the car. 30 women, at minimum, learned that lesson in the worst possible way. Their names deserve to be said. Joni Lenz, Linda Ann Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, Georgianne Hawkins, Janice Ott, Denise Naslund, Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura Aim, Deborah Kent, Karen Campbell, Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, Melanie Cooley, Shelley Robertson, Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, Kimberly Leach, and others unnamed or unconfirmed, whose families still wait. Each of them had a life, plans and friendships and things they loved. Each of them was, in the specific and irreplaceable way of every human being, completely irreducible to the role they have been assigned in his story. We owe them more than they have gotten. We owe them the insistence that their lives, and not his crimes, are what matters most in any true accounting of what Ted Bundy was and what he did. He was a man who killed people because he wanted to. He was brilliant enough to evade capture for years, charismatic enough to be remembered as something more complex than a killer, and self-aware enough to understand that the story of Ted Bundy would outlive Ted Bundy by decades. He was right about that. He has outlived himself. The question now, the only question that matters, is who we choose to center in the story we keep telling. It should be them. It should always have been them. Thanks for being here with Blurr, where every story leaves a shadow.